Welcome to Truth in the Dark. Here, we bring you real cases based on verified and credible sources. So, no more waiting, let's dive into the story. In May of 1994, a house in San Marino, California, was undergoing renovations. The project was proceeding as expected until the excavation of the backyard for the pool installation uncovered human remains buried beneath the surface. Suspenseful music. The revelation sent ripples through the quiet neighborhood, once thought to be a tranquil suburb. The remains lay interred approximately 4 feet beneath the surface, encased in 3 plastic bags, securely bound with twine. The skeletal remains were thought to be those of an adult Caucasian male, who had suffered a fatal blow to the head from a blunt instrument and endured 6 stab wounds, evident from the cuts in the flannel shirt he wore. Prior to its latest occupants, the residence was owned by Didi Sohus. Didi resided there with her son, John, and his wife, Linda, during the 1980s. John was a computer programmer, while Linda pursued her career as a sci-fi artist. On the property resided a British baronet named Christopher Chichester, who was granted the privilege of living rent-free in the guest house, while John and Linda's stay with Didi was brief. On February 8, 1985, the couple made the decision to relocate from California to New York in search of employment opportunities. Or at least that was one narrative. Linda had informed her mother, Susan Mayfield, that she would be spending a couple of weeks in Connecticut with John. Yet, silence enveloped them both, leaving no trace of their presence. Suspenseful music. 2 months after their departure, reports surfaced that they were missing. For an extended period, there was no indication of John or Linda, until one day, Linda's mother unexpectedly received a cryptic postcard from Paris, France. It said, "Mom, I believe we could use a geography lesson, but it wasn't too serious. Linda and John." 2 additional postcards were dispatched, purportedly also from Linda. Linda's mother remarked that her daughter lacked sufficient funds to make the journey to France when she went missing. Moreover, she didn't possess a passport at all. As a result, her family is skeptical about whether the postcards were genuinely sent by Linda. Interestingly, the handwriting on the postcards underwent analysis, revealing that Linda had penned at least one of them. They were not the sole ones to vanish. Shortly after John and Linda departed, Christopher Chichester vanished too. However, in contrast to the Sohus, there was no one actively searching for him at that moment. The mystery surrounding the disappearance of John and Linda Sohus remained unsolved for 10 long years. 10 years later, remains were discovered in Didi's former backyard. Following a thorough forensic examination, it was concluded that the bones belonged to John Sohus. He was never missing at all. He had met his end. Despite the escalation of John's disappearance to a murder investigation, the couple's case quickly grew cold once more. In 2008, a man named J.P. Clark Rockefeller found himself on the run after abducting his daughter in Boston during what was supposed to be a parental visit. Following an extensive week-long search, Rockefeller was apprehended and confronted with charges including kidnapping, assault, and battery involving a dangerous weapon, as well as endangering a minor. However, his inadvertent exposure unveiled another layer. Clark Rockefeller had an air of familiarity about him. He bore a striking resemblance to Christopher Chichester, who had resided in the Sohus guest house during the 1980s. Clark Rockefeller and Christopher Chichester were one and the same, yet neither name was his true identity. He was also recognized by the names Christopher Mountbatten Crowe, James Frederick, Michael Brown, and Chip Smith. However, his true identity was Christian Gerhartsreiter. He was not a British aristocrat, as he had claimed to the Sohus family, but rather a German national who arrived in America in 1978 at the age of 17. Throughout his life, Gerhartsreiter spun a web of deception, crafting intricate schemes to mask his true identity. Throughout the years, he had claimed to be an Ivy League graduate and a Hollywood producer, a bond broker on Wall Street, where he had somehow managed to oversee an entire department of genuine bond brokers. Finally, a scion of the affluent Rockefeller lineage, a ruse he maintained for roughly 2 decades. Gerhartsreiter deceived his way into elite circles, fabricated stories to secure significant positions, and even entered into a marriage with a wealthy woman, where he manipulated a substantial portion of her finances. His schemes were so expertly executed that he evaded capture until he had taken his daughter. Gerhartsreiter outright rejects his German identity, asserting instead that he is the offspring of Ann Carter, a child actress from America who gained fame in the 1940s. Carter, however, refutes the claim that he is her son. After the exposure of Gerhartsreiter's numerous deceptions, investigators revisited the case of the Sohus' disappearance from 2 decades prior. It seems unlikely that the presence of such a cunning trickster as their tenant during John's murder was merely a coincidence, doesn't it? A significant portion of the evidence was purely circumstantial. Another issue with the case was that, over the years, the upper and lower jaw discovered in the backyard had gone missing. It is with great sorrow that the coroner's office suggests they were likely cremated. In light of these complications, Gerhartsreiter faced charges for the murder of John Sohus. Gerhartsreiter refuted the claim. However, it came to light that during his time with them, Gerhartsreiter had claimed to John and Linda that he was a covert operative and that he had secured John a classified government position along with a top-secret mission, which was supposedly their destination when they departed from California, if they actually did leave at all. Evidence presented against Gerhartsreiter featured an elderly couple who asserted that he attempted to sell them a rug, which bore a quarter-sized bloodstain, while he was still residing at the Sohus' house. He later confessed to setting fire to a rug, believed to be the same one from which smoke was observed emanating from the guest house. A neighbor mentioned that Gerhartsreiter borrowed a chainsaw during the spring of 1985. During his stay at the guest house, Gerhartsreiter had a friend visit who inquired about the excavation taking place in the backyard. He explained it to them due to issues with the plumbing. For years after the Sohus' disappearance, John's truck surfaced in Connecticut, where it was being offered for sale by Christopher Chichester. After John and Linda disappeared, he seemed to disappear as well, changing his appearance by dyeing his hair blonde and growing a beard. Despite all of this, Gerhartsreiter's defense team claimed that the true murderer was John's wife, Linda. Given her continued absence, it was suggested that she had taken his life and deliberately disappeared. The evidence lay in the postcards from Europe that were supposedly dispatched by Linda. However, her friends challenged this notion, asserting that the couple had enjoyed a blissful marriage. Suspenseful music. The prosecution speculated that Gerhartsreiter might have dispatched the postcards to obscure his actions, creating the illusion that the Sohus were alive and thriving, all while attempting to implicate Linda. Within a rented locker in Baltimore lay an array of postcards from cities around the globe. There was a theory suggesting that Gerhartsreiter might have had an accomplice in Europe who was responsible for sending the postcards on his behalf. One possibility suggested is that Linda and Gerhartsreiter may have been involved in a romantic relationship, and together they might have been responsible for John's death. Or that Gerhartsreiter had taken John's life driven by jealousy over Linda. It seems more probable that the lead investigator proposed that Gerhartsreiter was attempting to deceive Dee into relinquishing her valuable house, with the hope that she would bequeath it to him. In this narrative, John's presence stood as the sole significant hurdle. Being her biological son, she would need to disinherit him for Gerhartsreiter to receive the inheritance. That is precisely what she accomplished. After years of silence from John, Dee was left with the heavy feeling that her son had forsaken her. She chose not to make Gerhartsreiter her heir, opting instead for a couple, the Weatherbys, who provided care for her in her final days. And who was it that brought them together? Gerhartsreiter. The revelation emerged that the Weatherbys had struck a deal with Gerhartsreiter. If he presented them with the fragile Dee, they would reward him with the funds from her estate upon her passing. Suspenseful music. They had, in fact, handed him $40,000 and assured him of an additional $100,000 to come. Although this information appears crucial to the case, it was never mentioned in court. Nonetheless, Gerhartsreiter was ultimately convicted of the first-degree murder of John Sohus. Even now, there remains no trace of Linda Sohus. The Whitaker family in Sugar Land, Texas, epitomized the ideal of familial harmony. Comprising Kent, who was employed at the family-run construction firm, along with his wife, Patricia, a former elementary school educator, and their 2 sons, Bart, age 23, and Kevin, age 19. In December 2003, the family gathered for a dinner to honor Bart's graduation from Sam Houston State University. Kent and Patricia presented Bart with an exquisite gift, a luxurious Rolex timepiece priced at $4,000. This extravagant gift mirrored the previous offerings to Bart, including several high-end vehicles, a lakeside townhouse, and coverage of his tuition at Baylor University. And most recently, Sam Houston State. Once the meal was finished, the family made their way back home. Upon Kevin's arrival at the front door, a masked intruder concealed within the home fired a shot, striking him in the chest. The projectile pierced through his heart. Patricia followed closely behind him, and she too was struck in the chest. Kent remained on the front porch. The bullet that hit him entered at an angle, piercing his chest just 6 inches from his heart, and traveled into his shoulder, where it fractured his humerus bone. Upon arriving home, Bart made his way to his Chevrolet Yukon to retrieve his cell phone and check for any messages. Upon hearing the gunshots, he hurried into the house to face the shooter. In that moment, a fierce struggle ensued, resulting in Bart sustaining a gunshot wound to his arm, while the assailant managed to flee through the rear exit. Kevin passed away mere moments after the gunfire. Patricia was airlifted to the hospital, but she tragically passed away before reaching her destination. Only Kent and Bart emerged from their injuries. What appeared to be a robbery interrupted by the Whitakers now seems meticulously orchestrated. The drawers were ajar, yet the contents remained undisturbed, and costly possessions in the home remained undisturbed. A 9mm Glock handgun, registered to Kevin, was discovered at the crime scene, alongside a men's black leather glove resting on the curb near Bart's Yukon. The intruder accessed the house via a crawl space located in Kevin's room on the 2nd floor. In that moment, they managed to breach his gun safe and take his firearm, a cherished gift from Bart. As the inquiry commenced, an unusual revelation came to light. Bart was never enrolled at Sam Houston University. He had deceived his parents regarding his attendance at school, all while pocketing the funds they provided for his tuition. This felt peculiar, yet appeared to have no connection. Then, Adam Hipp stepped into the spotlight. He attended Clements High School alongside Bart, and he informed the detectives that just 2 years earlier, in 2001, Bart had solicited his assistance in murdering his parents. The arrangement involved Hipp taking on the role of the gunman, positioned within the Whitaker residence as the family stepped out for dinner. Upon their return, he was meant to take aim at Kent, Patricia, and Kevin, ending their lives, and wound Bart in the arm to create the illusion that he was also a target rather than the one pulling the strings. Everything seems quite recognizable, doesn't it? Here's the truly unsettling aspect. Kent and Patricia were aware of the scheme to end their lives. The police were alerted after someone caught wind of the plan. Back then, it was regarded as too far-fetched to be taken seriously. Bart explained to his parents that it had all been a misunderstanding. Surprisingly, it was revealed that Bart had enlisted another student from Baylor to execute a comparable scheme a year prior in 2000. However, it had not come to fruition. In a bid to evade prosecution for his involvement in the previous scheme, Hipp consented to assist with the inquiry into the Whitaker shooting. To achieve this, he consented to document his discussions with Bart. During one of these discussions, Bart proposed $20,000 for him to mislead the police regarding his role in the 2001 scheme. He even dispatched $240 to a post office box in Dallas that they had established for the funds. I'm uncertain why the police chose not to bring Bart in, but their decision came back to haunt them in 2004 when Bart's Yukon was discovered, still operational yet vacant, close to a Houston apartment complex. For more than a year, Bart was nowhere to be found. The authorities reached out to those who had been near Bart during the incident, including his roommate, Chris Brashear, and a colleague, Stephen Champagne, to gather any information about his whereabouts. The authorities monitored the communications of both young men and summoned their acquaintances and relatives for questioning. This became the final tipping point for Champagne, prompting him to approach the police and admit his actions. He wasn't aware of Bart's whereabouts, but he was there to pick up Brashear from the Whitaker's house on the night of the shooting. He stated that Brashear was the one who had fired the shots. All that remained was the search for Bart. In September, a man named Rudy Rios recounted a startling tale to the police. He mentioned that Bart had purchased his ID from him and compensated him for driving him to Mexico. Upon arriving in Mexico, Bart assumed Rudy's identity and spun bizarre tales, claiming that his gunshot wound was a battle scar from Afghanistan, that he was an orphan, and that his mother had been a sex worker. At last, Bart was located and taken into custody. Bart had meticulously planned his family's shooting to secure an inheritance of $1.5 million, all while asserting that he had succumbed to the overwhelming pressure exerted by his family. He promised Champagne and Brashear that he would reward them with millions from his inheritance if they supported his scheme. Brashear entered into a plea agreement that would result in a life sentence, allowing for the chance of parole after 3 decades. Champagne received a 15-year sentence in return for providing testimony and is now free from incarceration. In just 30 minutes, the jury reached a verdict, declaring Bart guilty of capital murder and imposing the death penalty. In a twist that left many astonished, the individual advocating for Bart's life to be saved was none other than his father, the very man he had attempted to murder not just once, but on 3 separate occasions. On February 22, 2018, at precisely 6 p.m., Bart faced execution. He consumed his last meal, and, at 5:15, just as Bart was on the verge of being secured to the gurney, his sentence was transformed into life imprisonment thanks to his father's relentless advocacy that preserved his existence. Today, Bart's father comes to see him in prison, a place where he will remain for the entirety of his life. Suspenseful music. In November 2010, 13-year-old Yara Gambarejo set out just after 5 p.m. for her gymnastics practice. The gym was merely a short stroll away, just a few hundred meters from her home in Brembate di Sopra, Italy. At 7 p.m., she had yet to return home. When her parents were unable to reach her, they contacted the authorities. In a matter of moments, both state police and military personnel were deployed to search for Yara. The instructor observed the young girl as she exited the gym. She sent a text message to a friend at 6:44, and that marked the last moment anyone saw or heard from her. Bloodhounds trailed Yara's scent from her home to a quaint hamlet named Mapello, the last location where her phone had pinged. The thorough inquiry to locate Yara commenced with the surveillance of numerous phone lines, striving to identify those who had been in Mapello and in proximity to Yara's residence. The wiretaps uncovered an unusual remark from a Moroccan individual named Mohammed Fikri. He was heard saying, "Forgive me, God, I didn't kill her," by those interpreting the situation. Investigators delved into Fikri's activities, uncovering that he had embarked on a boat to Tangier. The circumstances raised eyebrows, leading to his arrest. A bloodstained mattress was discovered in his belongings, prompting fears that something dreadful had befallen Yara. However, upon his detention, it came to light that Fikri had been misinterpreted and the blood did not belong to Yara. Following Fikri's release, the focus of Italy shifted to the investigation surrounding the disappearance of the young girl. The nation was left in shock when, 3 months later, a man piloting a radio-controlled airplane noticed something unusual among the weeds in a field. A small pair of shoes. Suspenseful music. It was the decomposed and frozen body of Yara. Due to the intense media scrutiny surrounding the case, the autopsy was performed by Italy's most renowned forensic pathologist. Yara had succumbed to exposure after being assaulted and abandoned in a field. While she had not been sexually assaulted, her body bore numerous lacerations from a sharp object. Additionally, traces of lime were found in her respiratory passages, along with remnants of a vegetable fiber typically used in rope making on her clothing, indicating that her assailant likely had a background in construction. Suspenseful music. A male's DNA sample was found on Yara's underwear, suggesting the attacker sustained injuries during a confrontation with her. Given the limited evidence, the case hinged on this DNA sample. The investigation was extensive. Suspenseful music. In fact, it became the most costly manhunt in Italian history, with 18,000 DNA samples collected throughout the inquiry. Following extensive testing, investigators uncovered a significant lead. The sample discovered on Yara bore a strong resemblance to that of a man named Damiano Garanoni. However, Garanoni had been in South America at the time of Yara's disappearance, and his DNA did not match perfectly. Instead, it indicated a familial connection to Yara's assailant. The challenge arose from the fact that Garanoni's father had 11 siblings, complicating the search considerably. In a fervent search for a match, Garanoni's uncle, Giuseppe, was requested for a DNA sample. However, he had passed away in 1999, 11 years prior to Yara's murder. Nevertheless, Giuseppe's widow presented investigators with a box containing some of his old documents. Among them was a paper copy of his driving license and a postcard he had sent to his family. Both bore stamps that Giuseppe had licked prior to his passing, and the police recognized the potential for obtaining a DNA sample from them. The analysis confirmed that Giuseppe Garanoni was indeed the father of Yara's alleged murderer. Giuseppe had 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons, Pier Paolo and Diego. However, neither son matched the DNA of the perpetrator, and neither had children. There was only one answer. Giuseppe had an illegitimate child whose DNA was found on Yara. Giuseppe Garanoni's body was even exhumed so his DNA could be verified as the father of the suspect, which it was. Suspenseful music. The hunt now was to uncover Giuseppe's affair that had happened 30 to 40 years prior. Before long, it became apparent that the authorities were on the hunt for scandal, and whispers, insights, and long-buried secrets began to surface. One particular lead emerged from a colleague of Giuseppe's, a fellow bus driver, who recounted that Giuseppe had entangled himself with a woman back in the 70s or 80s. It was believed her name was Esther Arzuffi. However, Arzuffi's DNA had already undergone testing, revealing no match. It was at this point that investigators recognized an error had occurred. Her DNA had been compared to Yara's instead of the suspect's. Arzuffi firmly denied any affair, maintaining her marriage and insisting that her twins, a boy and a girl, were not Giuseppe's. The boy's name was Massimo Giuseppe Bassetti. Was Massimo's middle name merely a coincidence? Investigators remained skeptical about Arzuffi's honesty. At 43, Massimo was a builder residing in Mapello, the hamlet close to Yara's home. His work in construction might account for the lime discovered on Yara. The police established a deceptive roadblock for breathalyzer tests and collected 2 DNA samples from Massimo as he drove by. He was the biological son of Giuseppe and a perfect match to the DNA of Yara's suspected murderer. Ultimately, Massimo was convicted of Yara Gambareggio's murder and received a life sentence. Curiously, Massimo's mother continues to refute any claims of infidelity, insisting that the entire situation is beyond comprehension. Suspenseful music. On December 15, 1980, 31-year-old Melanie Uribe, a divorced mother of an 8-year-old son and a nurse in California, failed to arrive for her shift at Pacoima Memorial Hospital. Concerned co-workers, unable to reach her by phone, contacted the authorities to report her missing. Melanie's sudden disappearance captured media attention, yet no clues emerged regarding her fate. 2 days after her disappearance, Etta Louise Smith, a shipping clerk at the Lockheed Aerospace plant, tuned into a news report about Melanie when an unusual occurrence took place. The aerospace worker would later recount that she experienced a feeling, a vision, a psychic moment, whatever you choose to label it. Etta discovered a woman's body resting on a secluded hillside in Lopez Canyon, overlooking Lake View Terrace. She felt compelled to inform the police about Melanie's location and share her psychic experience. Although met with doubt, Etta's security clearance and professional background ensured that the investigators took her seriously and did not dismiss her. They had her mark a location on the map corresponding to the vision she had experienced. Etta made her way home, gathered 2 of her children and her niece, and set off towards the area where she had envisioned Melanie's body. A nagging concern lingered in her mind that the police might dismiss her claims and fail to investigate. As a group, they scoured the canyon road. After approximately half an hour of searching, Etta's daughter spotted a nude body. Etta reached out to the forest rangers and police, revealing the chilling find. It was Melanie Uribe. Suspenseful music. She had suffered a brutal fate, kidnapped, assaulted, and ultimately murdered. The authorities quickly turned their gaze toward Etta. How could a stranger's psychic vision lead to Melanie? They suspected her involvement in the crime and detained Etta for an extensive 10-hour interrogation. Afterward, she underwent a strip search and was left without shoes in a cell, deprived of food and water for a full 24 hours. Suspenseful music. Investigators anticipated that Etta would ultimately crack and reveal the truth about how she had discovered Melanie's body. Despite the lack of evidence linking Etta to the crime, she was taken into custody on December 18th, the day following her vision. Suspenseful music. Amidst the unfolding chaos, a man reveled in his heinous acts of robbery, assault, and murder against a woman. The neighbors, horrified by his bragging, promptly alerted the police with the chilling account. He was taken into custody on December 21st. During the interrogation, he named 2 accomplices in the crime: a 17-year-old, whose identity remains undisclosed, 20-year-old Louis Carnell Morgan, and 21-year-old Spencer Nelson. The 3 men noticed Melanie sitting in her pickup truck, idling at a traffic light. They leaped into her vehicle, compelling her to drive into the canyon, where they assaulted, robbed, and attacked her before striking her in the head with a rock. The police were convinced the men had some link to Etta, yet none of them recognized her. For days post-arrest, Etta found her freedom. If she was unfamiliar with Melanie and her assailants, how had she managed it? Could it genuinely be a psychic occurrence as she claims? The police provided an alternative narrative. Instead of a supernatural insight, they suggested she likely deduced the whereabouts of Melanie's body through local chatter or other ordinary methods. Melanie's 3 killers faced conviction for her murder, each receiving sentences that could extend to life in prison. 6 years later, Etta Smith took legal action against the Los Angeles police for false arrest, ultimately winning her case and being awarded $26,184. After that, Etta ceased to share any further visions, if she had them at all. Suspenseful music. In September 2010, 55-year-old Greg Flanagan, an oil man from Louisiana, entered the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas. He entered his room, number 348, but he never emerged again. Greg and his wife, Susie, typically conversed on the phone each morning. However, the following day, he failed to call her and did not appear at his office. 2 of his co-workers, concerned, went to the hotel to search for him. They requested the hotel manager to unlock his room. His body lay on the floor, the television casting a flickering glow. Candy bars and cigarettes were strewn about near the bed. The $1,000 in cash remained untouched in his room. There were no indications of a break-in, no evidence of a struggle, no trace of anyone else having entered. His body bore no blood or wounds. Greg had been a heavy smoker, so much so that a cigarette lingered between 2 of his fingers at the moment of his passing. It was presumed that Greg succumbed to natural causes, perhaps a heart attack. Nevertheless, his body was dispatched to the medical examiner for a definitive cause of death. On the surface, everything about his demise appeared ordinary, yet the examination uncovered an unforeseen revelation. His ribs lay shattered, a testament to the violence he endured. Lacerations marred his liver, stomach, and scrotum, while a gaping hole punctured his heart. Bruises encircled his groin and right hip, evidence of the brutality inflicted upon him. Fragments of partially digested food had been violently expelled from his intestines. A blow to his chest had been so catastrophic that it sealed his fate. The verdict of his demise was homicide. Greg Flanagan had met a brutal end, either beaten or crushed to death. The investigators found themselves skeptical of the autopsy results. They simply didn't align with the evidence at the crime scene. There was nothing substantial enough in his room to account for such a fate. Yet, the report was unequivocal. Greg had endured severe internal injuries akin to those of crash victims or individuals crushed by a heavy object. However, one remarkably significant and peculiar detail emerged. Despite the extensive harm inflicted on Greg's internal organs, his torso remained largely unscathed. There was minimal bruising, save for the area around his groin, indicating that the injuries were predominantly internal. Only a handful of plausible explanations could account for this. It seemed that Greg had likely endured an assault elsewhere before making his way back to his room, where he ultimately succumbed. Due to the trauma inflicted on his body, he would have succumbed to internal bleeding in under 30 seconds. Therefore, it was impossible for Greg to have returned to his room. He must have been assaulted there, yet no evidence remained. Everything was undisturbed, and the neighbors claimed they heard nothing. It's puzzling, isn't it? The only odd detail that investigators uncovered was that earlier in the evening, Greg had prepared microwave popcorn, which caused an electrical circuit to blow. The circuit breaker in his room needed immediate attention, prompting the maintenance man to come up. This sparked a theory. The maintenance man had a history as a known sex offender. It was possible that the injuries to Greg's scrotum and internal organs resulted from a strange and brutal attack. However, this hypothesis was dismissed since the maintenance worker had a solid alibi. The subsequent theory pointed to the men occupying the adjacent room to Greg. This group of electricians frequently gathered in one room at night to indulge in drinks. When Greg knocked out the power, it's possible that tensions flared, leading to a confrontation in the hallway where he was assaulted before retreating to his room, ultimately resulting in his death. However, this scenario felt unlikely, as the men claimed they hadn't seen Greg, and his injuries didn't align with the idea of a beating. Additionally, the cigarette found in his hand appeared too nonchalant to correspond with such a violent encounter. This case presented one of the most perplexing challenges for investigators, leading to months of stagnation. In a bid to uncover the truth, Greg's family ultimately announced a $50,000 reward for any information, yet no one stepped forward. Enter Ken Brennan, the renowned private investigator and former Long Island cop and DEA special agent, who took on the task of solving Greg's case. Brennan embarked on a thorough interview process, speaking with everyone from Greg's wife to the medical examiner. A subtle clue emerged that had eluded others: the cigarette found in Greg's left hand, while his wife maintained he smoked with his right. Brennan proposed that he might have stood up and switched the cigarette to his other hand, possibly to open the door. This clue pointed towards the electricians in the adjacent room. It was possible that Greg had risen to answer the door when they knocked after he had caused the power outage. Some of his injuries, including the laceration to his scrotum, could have resulted from a kick delivered by steel-toed boots, typical of what electricians might wear. As Brennan questioned the electricians, he came to understand why this theory had been set aside. However, another layer unfolded during these discussions. One of the individuals mentioned a firearm discharging in a hotel. This sparked a sudden idea for Brennan. The hotel room underwent another examination, this time specifically searching for a bullet. After hours of meticulous searching, nothing surfaced. That was until Brennan spotted a minor, mended dent in the wall. As he examined the adjacent room, he noticed the faint trace of a bullet piercing the wall. The exit point must have been that dent in Greg's room. It was clear Greg had been shot. However, the medical examiner dismissed Brennan's hypothesis. There was no bullet wound on Greg's body, and they certainly wouldn't overlook something as significant as that. However, they took a closer look at the autopsy photos. Brendan inquired whether a bullet could have penetrated Greg's body through his scrotum, noting the lacerations and bruising present. The examiner concurred, suggesting that it was indeed possible if the bullet had struck at just the right angle. This could have concealed the entry point due to the folds of flesh. A bullet would have ripped through his body, accounting for the blunt force trauma to his organs that resembled a brutal beating. It was the hole in Greg's heart that swayed the examiner. Initially believed to be a ruptured right atrium from blunt force trauma, the doctor came to understand it was, in fact, a bullet wound. Greg had indeed been shot. On the night of his death, several electricians were enjoying drinks in the adjacent room. Among them was Lance Mueller, who was carelessly handling a 9mm Ruger pistol. In a tragic turn of events, the gun discharged, sending a bullet through the wall and into Greg's room, where it hit him as he held his cigarette. He fell to the ground, leaving little trace of the events that transpired. The electricians, at that moment, were uncertain if anyone was in the adjacent room, as they genuinely claimed not to have seen Greg. In an attempt to conceal the mark of a bullet hole in his room, Mueller resorted to using toothpaste. When Greg's death was deemed a result of natural causes, Mueller considered it a dreadful twist of fate. He found himself in handcuffs, facing charges for the manslaughter of Greg Flanagan. In the courtroom, he opted for a no-contest plea regarding the charges of reckless manslaughter and criminally negligent manslaughter. Ultimately, he was convicted and handed a 10-year sentence. The intricate details surrounding Greg's case could easily be described as one of the most bizarre I've ever encountered.